Hey everyone, my name is Lauren Mackey, and this is a case study presentation I made about Brazil. I'm going to give a brief introduction to Brazil, and then I'm going to go into some more details on topics like nation and society in Brazil, the history of Brazil, Brazil's state and political economy, and some challenges Brazil faces as a democracy. Okay, so the capital of Brazil is Brasilia, which is located in the middle of the southern half of Brazil. The total size of the country is 8,514,877 square kilometers. The population is 203 million people, and the GDP per capita is around $11,875. Brazil is ranked 73 on the Human Development Index. Brazil is officially called the Federative Republic of Brazil. The head of state and government in Brazil is President Dilma Rousseff. Federal constitution is the primary legal base for all of Brazil. Each of the 26 states may have their own individual constitution as long as it does not directly contradict federal law. Brazil is the fifth largest country in the world and the first largest country in South America, taking up 47% of the area. It was previously occupied by tribal nations, but the area was taken by Portugal in 1500. Brazil declared independence in 1822, and as of 1988, it is a federal republic. I will go more into the history of Brazil later on. Okay, now I'm going to cover nation and society in Brazil, which is demographics and stuff like that. So, as I previously mentioned, the population of Brazil is approximately 203 million people. The majority of the people are Roman Catholic, followed in number by Protestants. About 8% of people in Brazil do not participate in any religion, with even fewer participating in Spiritism or other religious views. Nearly half of the Brazilian population is white, 43.1% are multiracial or pardo, and the remaining 9% are black, Asian, or indigenous. The Brazilian population is quite diverse. The reasons for this are colonialism and immigration. I will break down the history of Brazil's population by region in the next slides. Okay. The southern part of Brazil is mainly populated by whites. This is due to European immigration to the area. In the 1700s, Portuguese Azorean settlers from the Portuguese Azores Islands were beginning to populate the areas around Santa Catarina and Rio Grande do Sul. They survived off of fishing and agriculture. Around the end of the 18th century, black slaves were taken to the Rio Grande do Sul. When Brazil achieved independence from Portugal in 1822, they started to accept German immigrants. These immigrants were mostly small farmers. It is estimated by the early 20th century there were 50,000 Germans in the region. Starting around 1875, Italian immigrants were also populating the area of southern Brazil. They were mostly from Veneto, Italy, and these people originally settled in highlands of Rio Grande do Sul, but later spread out. Around the same time, Polish people, originally from Russia, also began settling in southern Brazil. Southeast Brazil contains the oldest Portuguese settlements. It is a region inhabited since colonization by blacks, whites, and indigenous people. There are also the Bandeirantes, a people created by the mix of native and white couples. The Bandeirantes found gold in the region in the late 1600s. This piqued the interest of Portuguese settlers, who then flocked to the area. There was a war to decide who would control the mines, and the Portuguese won the war. As a result, black slaves were brought over from Africa to work in the mines. Later, many of the Portuguese noble family moved to Brazil. And in the late 1900s, a large number of immigrants, mostly Italian, moved to the southeast region of Brazil. Many more immigrants moved to the area, including people from Japan. In the northeast, Portuguese settlers formed relationships with many of the native and African women in the area. Northern Brazil is in the Amazon rainforest region and was mainly inhabited by indigenous people until the late 1800s. The central western part of Brazil was also mainly inhabited by indigenous people until Portuguese settlers came due to interest in mines. They too formed relationships with each other, and later on, Italian and German settlers also immigrated to the area. Okay, to sort of expand on the nation and society of Brazil, I'm going to briefly talk about other parts of its history. The Portuguese, headed by Pedro Cabral, arrived in Brazil in 1500. The original settlers were not highly interested in conquest of the land, but instead they sought valuable items which they could trade. By skirting the outer edges of Brazil, the first Portuguese people in Brazil were able to find the Brazilwood tree. This was one of the main things they traded, which they used it to make red dyes. Not too long after, sugar began to be grown and harvested in Brazil. Because of this, the first black slaves were brought to Brazil from Africa. As I mentioned earlier, the discovery of gold in the late 1600s is what caused the Portuguese to move inland, but the gold quickly thinned out, and so agriculture remained as Brazil's biggest asset. Around the beginning of the 1800s, Dom João, Prince Regent of Portugal between 1816 and 1822, arrived in Brazil. He returned to Portugal in 1821 and left the territory in control of his son, Dom Pedro. Shortly after, Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence from Portugal. This was the start of the Empire of Brazil, with Pedro becoming emperor starting in December 1822. After the drafting of a legal constitution in 1824, Brazil's independence was recognized by the United States, Portugal, and Britain in the following years. Dom Pedro named his son Dom Pedro II as his successor. At this point, agriculture was still important in Brazil in the 1800s, but the main crop switched from sugar to coffee. This new agricultural priority brought many new workers from Europe. This is when the previously mentioned Italian and German settlers started arriving in Brazil. In 1889, Dom Pedro II was removed from his rule and Brazil was declared a republic. Deodoro da Fonseca became the first president of what is known as the Old Republic or First Republic of Brazil. During this period, there was a separation of church and state, and a constitution of the republic was created. However, Fonseca dissolved Congress and was subsequently removed from office. A civil war in the South started up around 1893, but by 1894, a new president, Prudente José de Moraes Barros, had assumed office. This was Brazil's first civilian president. Brazil went through many changes after this, becoming a different republic in 1946 and later becoming a military republic in 1964. By 1885, the Brazilian military relinquished their power, which returned the state to a democracy and started the new Republic of Brazil. This new republic is the current form of government that Brazil has today. Okay, now I'm going to describe a little bit of Brazil's political economy. After gaining independence and becoming its own federal republic state, Brazil made progress in developing its economy. By 2009, the growth of Brazil was becoming apparent to the rest of the world. However, the rise of Brazil's growing economy did not last long. After hitting 7.5% growth, Brazil changed leadership and saw a dramatic fall. Economic growth in Brazil is now around 0.9%. With a population around 203 million, the unemployment rate is around 5.5%. As stated previously, the GDP in Brazil is around $11,875 per capita. Inflation is at a rate of 5.4%. Many see Brazil's bizarre tax code as part of the reason for the drop in economic growth. Companies in Brazil are faced with ridiculously high payroll taxes, which are above 50%. Pensions are funded at 70%, an astonishing amount more than infrastructure, which is only funded at 1.5% of GDP. For comparison, most countries spend nearly 4% of their GDP on infrastructure. With the way things are, companies are paying nearly a quarter of the value of their products just to get them to the shipping areas. And currently, the people of Brazil are dealing with problems caused or exacerbated by President Dilma Rousseff. On a related note, Brazilian companies are faced with poor regulatory efficiency, trade restrictions on some imports, and high taxes. However, their resources and skills are abundant. Brazil is a large exporter of food, the third largest in the world, and within a decade, oil will become another one of its major exports. There are few ethnic and social problems standing in the way, so Brazil can see economic improvement once again under correct leadership. But in order to see this improvement, Brazilian government needs to reform public spending, make the market more competitive for their businesses, and reform politically. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the structure of the state, and that's going to be pretty much the rest of the presentation, except for challenges that Brazil faces, but I'm going to start with the structure of the state. So, Brazil is governed by the federal government of Brazil, which is called the Union. The structure is based on representative democracy. It has an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judiciary branch. The federal constitution defines all of the laws and relationships in Brazil between the states and the people within Brazil. The executive branch of Brazil consists of the president, currently Dilma Rousseff, as mentioned earlier, the vice president, currently Michel Temer, and the cabinet. Ministers of state and the senior advisors of the executive branch are appointed by the president, and they make up the cabinet. There are 24 ministries of state and 14 other cabinet positions. The legislative branch, called the National Congress of Brazil, is bicameral. It contains the Federal Senate and the Chamber of Deputies. The Federal Senate has 81 seats, composed of 3 members from each of the 26 states and 3 members from the Federal District. Members can serve for 8-year periods, with 1/3 elected after a period of 4 years and the remaining 2/3 elected after another 4 years. The Chamber of Deputies has 513 seats filled with members proportional to the populations of the states. Members can serve for 4-year terms. All of the members of the National Congress of Brazil have no limit on the amount of terms they can serve if they are re-elected. The judiciary branch has a state-level system and a federal-level system. The state territories are divided into comarcas, which each have at least one trial court, called the First Court of Instance. Unless there is a crime against life, judges will make their decisions without the help of a jury. Each state also has a second court of instance, called the Courts of Justice or Appeal Courts. Decisions in these courts are decided by 3 judges, and they have 2 chambers, civil and criminal. The federal-level judiciary has 5 regional federal courts and 2 national superior courts. The superior courts are divided into the Superior Courts of Justice and the Supreme Federal Court. The purpose of these courts is to evaluate the application of the law and the Constitution. Okay, so here are some challenges Brazil faces as a democracy. Because Brazil is a democracy, but it is not an advanced democracy, so although the structure of the government is good, there have been recent news of corruption within the government of Brazil. As little as 2 years ago, in 2012, Brazilian Congress members were reported to have been buying votes. The people of Brazil are unhappy with the state of their government, to the point of organizing ongoing protests, which started in June 2013. These protests were against the transportation cost increases, government spending priorities, and police brutality. Some of the protests became more geared towards the police brutality, with protesters breaking laws and instigating fights with the police. Police brutality has been a problem in Brazil in poor areas due to drug-related crimes, but now the acts are being demonstrated on other citizens as well. Protests are still going on today for various reasons. The most recent target is the World Cup, hosted in Brazil. As mentioned earlier, Brazil is becoming economically stunted. This is mainly due to institutional issues such as the trade and investment restrictions, high taxes, income inequality, and unequal wealth distribution. However, the issues Brazil faces as a democracy can be overcome. The main things that need to be done are reformation of economic policies and eradication of corruption within the government. Although the current president is supposedly not doing much to make these changes, perhaps with new leadership, Brazil can become a more successful democracy. And, alright everybody, this is going to conclude my case study presentation. Thank you for listening.